Uranus, Poseidon, and Pluton are the three ancient weapons with the power to destroy the world, and I believe it's very likely that we've already seen all three of them. So in this video, we'll be discussing the ancient weapons, going through all the candidates that could be ancient weapons, and finally coming to a conclusion on what they are. As always, if you enjoy content like this, make sure you subscribe and join our King Pirates crew, and if you have a good time watching this video, please drop a like for the YouTube algorithm. Alright, but first things first, let's just break down some basic information and talk about the current ancient weapons that we already know about. Throughout the story, we've gotten a lot of hints and a lot of teases about ancient weapons pretty much as soon as we got into the Grand Line and Alabasta, but the first time we really found out some important information about the ancient weapons was in Fishman Island. That was when we not only got confirmation of the first ancient weapon in Poseidon, which is Shirahoshi, but we also found out the name of all three of them: Uranus, Poseidon, and Pluton. The names of these ancient weapons are named after Greek and Roman gods, symbolizing their destructive power, and the destructive power of these ancient weapons has really been the one consistent thing within all the information and all the teases dropped about the ancient weapons. Besides that though, over 1,000 chapters deep into the story, we still don't really know much more about them. As a matter of fact, the only ancient weapon that we know about and have actually seen in action is Poseidon, which I do think is an important thing to take note of because it gives us an example to compare to. And Poseidon's power is a pretty strong one. It's Shirahoshi's ability to not only communicate but command the Sea Kings. And when I say Sea Kings, I don't mean the Lord of the Sea that Luffy punched in chapter 1. Instead, these are the biggest sea kings in the ocean, spanning over 5 kilometers long. Each one of them are literally longer than a race that people run. So when it comes to destructive power, Poseidon definitely lives up to its name. Speaking of names, it also reflects its name with its abilities. Poseidon, of course, is the god of the sea, so Shirahoshi being able to command sea kings makes perfect sense. But in the end, the most important clue that we got out of Poseidon was information about its past. Because as we found out from Neptune, the previous Poseidon lived during the Void Century, made a promise with Joy Boy to pull the Noah up to the surface, but unfortunately Joy Boy couldn't keep that promise, so instead, the fishmen have been keeping the Noah safe for the day that the new Joy Boy arrives and fulfills the promise. Now this bit of information is some really important stuff that we could do a total deep dive into, but I'm not going to talk about the Joy Boy stuff because I want to save that for a separate video. But as far as Poseidon goes, I think it's important to note that the ancient weapons were clearly connected to ancient history. Sounds a lot more obvious when you say it out loud, I guess. In addition, we also have another ancient weapon that we know of but have never seen before, and that of course is Pluton. It was the first ancient weapon that we found out about in Alabasta, but in Water 7 was when we found out it was a battleship. Its current whereabouts are unknown except to Robin because she knows everything, but she currently knows the location of Pluton because she read the information from the Alabasta poneglyph. And ironically, another person that knows some important information about Pluton is Frankie because he was the last person to have the blueprints before he burned it. Besides that though, that's pretty much all the main points we know about Pluton, but there are some specific things we should focus on. First off, I think Pluton's connection to Alabasta is important to note because it's another connection to ancient history, and that's because Alabasta is one of the oldest countries. It was actually one of the original 20 world government countries, but in the end they decided to leave the world government and then were entrusted with this very important poneglyph with the location of Pluton. And that creates some interesting conflicting motivations because we know that the poneglyphs were created to preserve the history and protect it from the world government. Yet at the same time, Alabasta was one of the original 20 countries in the world government. So I think based off of this information, I think we can assume that Alabasta left the world government and switched sides. And my theory on this is that Pluton was also created for a purpose, maybe not a super specific one like Poseidon, but it does serve a purpose of some sort, which is why the poneglyph is still being preserved and saved. And the last thing I think is interesting to examine is how Pluton reflects its name, because unlike Poseidon, with Pluton being supposedly a battleship, the connection is not as clear because Pluto is the god of the underworld, and while you might be able to make a connection that the ship is built from a bunch of minerals and like underground stuff, or that it kills so many people that it's the god of the underworld, it feels like a bit of a reach. So that's just something to keep in mind as we discuss the possibilities of what Pluton could be. Beyond that though, that's pretty much all the information that we have about ancient weapons. But as the story is going into its final saga, they will definitely come into play soon, so let's talk about some candidates of what they could be. And the first one I want to talk about is the one I think that is most likely, and that is Zunesha / Momonosuke, because he might have the ability to control it. And honestly, this one I am incredibly confident that it is an ancient weapon of some sort. First off, in terms of just destructive power, I don't think it gets much bigger than Zunesha. I've talked about the size of Zunesha before on this channel, so TLDR, it's fucking huge. But once again, just to emphasize how big Zunesha is, it's 35 kilometers by 20 kilometers long. That means if you take one Sea King and stretch them out out like he's Luffy, you would still need 7 of them to reach the height of Zunesha. So I think the sheer size of Zunesha definitely compares to the horde of Sea King Shirahoshi has, and in terms of destructive power, we saw it firsthand against Jack. A Yonko commander with a 1 billion berry bounty was just swatted like a fly. So honestly, if Zunesha is not an ancient weapon, he should be made into one because the destructive power is definitely on that level. So really the question to me is which ancient weapon Zunesha is, and for the longest time I always thought it was Uranus. Uranus of course is the only ancient weapon we have no information on, so we could only really go off its name. And in mythology, Uranus is the god of the sky, and I'm sure there's a lot more information we could dive into, like which god his cousin is slept with, but I don't really think we need to. These ancient weapon names are pretty straightforward, like Poseidon's the god of the sea, so its powers relate to the sea. So as far as Uranus goes, I think it just has to relate to the sky in some way. And for Zunesha, I think it fits into that description and kind of relates to the sky, because while it's not a flying elephant, it's pretty damn tall. Just to give you some context, I'm gonna use Earth as an example, because on Earth, the lower stratosphere is 20 kilometers tall. So if Zunesha was on Earth, it would literally be peeking into the lower stratosphere. So with its height alone, I think Zunesha qualifies to be called the god of the sky. So in my opinion, Zunesha being Uranus always made a lot of sense, and that was always my theory on it. Either Zunesha itself being an ancient weapon, or that Momonosuke was the ancient weapon able to control Zunesha. And on top of that, beyond its destructive powers, Zunesha also has other things backing it up being an ancient weapon. Because another thing to note is that it's also connected to ancient history, and it's been around for a long time. And on top of that, with the recent information we got from the manga, it just kind of confirms things further. And this is where I'm gonna quickly talk about those things. So if you're not yet caught up to the manga, chapter 1040, go skip to the next section. But yeah, in the manga, in the recent chapters, we found out a lot more about Zunesha, most recently that he was a comrade of Joy Boy. So to me, this just further confirms that Zunesha is an ancient weapon, because Poseidon was also a comrade of Joy Boy. So there's still no doubt in my mind that Zunesha is an ancient weapon, but I am open to the possibility that it might be Pluton. This is another theory that's been popping up recently because of the information we found out about, and it mostly relates to the mysterious devil fruit that the girls say we're talking about, and Zunesha possibly eating it. So maybe it's possible that Zunesha is a battleship that ate an elephant fruit. Overall, I'm still a little against this idea, because first off, Pluton has always been talked about as this battleship with a lot of different weapons, and if it turned out now it's just a big ass elephant and the blueprints and everything like that just didn't matter anymore, that'd be slightly disappointing. And I also don't think it would make sense. Like, why would you develop all of these weapons only to turn the battleship into an elephant? Maybe Zunesha could still use some of those weapons in elephant form, but there's also some conflicting information here as well. Like, the girls say no that Pluton is a battleship, but also know about this devil fruit. Yeah, on their end they think they're different things. On top of that, the Alabasta poneglyph is supposed to give the location of Pluton, and you literally cannot do that with Zunesha because it's always walking. I guess it could have straight up just revealed that Zunesha is Pluton, which would mean that Robin just has the biggest poker face and has been hiding this info this whole time, which to be fair perfectly fits her character. But overall, if I had to pick, I would still pick Zunesha being Uranus, but I'm still even more certain that one way or another is definitely an ancient weapon. Moving on to the next option though, we get to a candidate that's a complete wild card to me, and that is the egg on Roger's ship. And this was a wild card to me because the theory I believe in the most is Zunesha being Uranus, but at the same time there is some very interesting evidence that the egg on Roger's ship could be Uranus as well. For those of you that don't remember, on Roger's ship, the Oro Jackson, there's always been this mysterious large egg, and I absolutely believe that egg is an important thing and it's not just like a weird design choice, because first off, that's a pretty weird thing just to have chilling on a ship, and second of all, Oda has still yet to address it, which makes it even more suspicious. Like, I think if the egg was truly meaningless, by now Oda would have addressed it in SPS, but he hasn't done that yet, which makes me believe that egg is actually important, and many people speculate that it's actually an ancient weapon. And the biggest supporting evidence people have pointed to is actually something that wasn't in the manga. It was canon material that we saw in the movie / chapter 0 involving Shiki and Roger. This incident took place during the Ed War, where Shiki took on Roger and had him surrounded, during which Shiki specifically says to Roger, "We'll use that apocalyptic weapon that you found." And that I feel like is as obvious as you can get. He's definitely talking about an ancient weapon. And because Shiki says this line to Roger while he's pointing and looking at Roger, people speculate that he's talking about the egg. And another thing that backs up this theory is what happened during the Ed War, because in the end there was this crazy storm that turned the tides and allowed the battle to end in a draw, which feels like a very convenient coincidence that might have actually been caused by something. And that something maybe was the egg, ancient weapon Uranus, the god of the sky, allowing it to change the weather. And I gotta say, it's a pretty interesting theory, especially when you look at all of the evidence and everything that happened at the Ed War, which is why this theory is my wild card, but I will point out some counter arguments. First off, there is the possibility that that storm was just a coincidence, and second of all, even if the storm was caused by something, maybe it wasn't the egg and actually something else. Could have been something like a devil fruit that we'll talk about a little later. But even on top of that, there are some translation differences between the scans of chapter 0 and the movie, because in the scans, Shiki only says that Roger knows the location of ancient weapon, which if that was the case, he could have been referring to something else, like maybe Pluton that Tom had the blueprint of. So while this theory is very interesting, it's definitely not as concrete. The one thing that does really intrigue me here is the potential of dragons, because the fact that we haven't actually seen any real dragons within One Piece is very weird to me. Not only are dragons a pretty important theme within the story, and we've seen it in like devil fruits and science experiments and even first names, but also they're just such a major fantasy element, it's kind of weird for Oda not to use them yet in the story. But at the same time, he only hasn't shown us real dragons in the story because dragons actually do exist in One Piece. First off, with Vegapunk's experiments, the fact that he's trying to create dragons means that actual dragons should be real. And second of all, we know that Ryuma had killed a dragon before, so dragons definitely exist within the One Piece world. So I actually think it's very likely that we will eventually see a real dragon within One Piece, and what better weapon to have as the god of the sky than a dragon? So I think it's possible that egg is a dragon egg and an ancient weapon, and it will be a great way to introduce dragons into the story. So even though this theory is not concrete and definitely has its counter arguments, I still kind of like it. So with that said, let's move on to some crazier options, and this next one might seem very crazy on the surface, and that is Vivi. Now this one I'm actually not going to dive too deep into because I've talked about it before in a previous video that you can check out right here. But essentially the idea here is that Vivi, just like Shirahoshi and potentially Momonosuke, is an ancient weapon. Now you might be wondering, where exactly does this theory come from? There's been no showcase from Vivi that she has any ancient weapon abilities, and honestly it really all just goes back to one panel, and that's the panel of Vivi shouting to everybody in Alabasta to stop fighting. And as she shouted that out, the rain started falling. So first off, not only is that another case of a very convenient coincidence, but second of all, that double page spread actually looked very similar to when Shirahoshi used her abilities. So that could be some visual foreshadowing that Oda is using. And as far as which ancient weapon Vivi could be, I guess it could be either. If she really had the ability to create rain, she could be Uranus, or maybe because of Alabasta's connection to Pluton, she could be Pluton. Now I already know some of you are angrily commenting that Vivi is not a battleship, but obviously in this situation, Pluton would actually not be a battleship, and maybe the blueprints are just a way to go against Pluton. A crazy theory I've seen on this is that maybe Vivi has the ability to control those giant shadows from the Florian triangle. But this one I feel like is a much more fun headcanon because there's really nothing connecting the two. I do think those giant shadows from the Florian triangle will become important later. I'm just not sure if they're actually related to ancient weapons because we don't actually know what they are. If they are actually things that big, obviously they would be ancient weapons. I definitely think it's possible that those things are actually not that big and it's just an illusion. Overall though, with this Vivi idea, I think it's a pretty fun one that I liked a lot more before, but now that I'm thinking about it more, there's just not that much evidence supporting it. But either way, I'm just excited to see Vivi return to the story soon. With that said, let's move on to our final candidate, and that is the broad category of devil fruits. The most prominent theory I've seen on this is Dragon having a devil fruit that is an ancient weapon because of how he shifted the weather to save Luffy. Also, his name is literally Dragon, so him having Uranus could make sense. But while I do like this idea, especially with the possibility that it might be connected to Roger and Roger's egg, there's really not enough information at this point to consider this a concrete theory, because in the end, Dragon could have a weather-related devil fruit and it might not be an ancient weapon, because it's not like the powers he used at Locktown was that destructive. So right now, I don't believe in this theory too much, but I do think Dragon is going to be an absolute beast. Beyond that though, I've seen a lot of other devil fruit ancient weapon theories, like a water fruit, but most of them don't really have that much evidence and are more so just fun headcanon theories. So in the end, if I had to choose what the ancient weapons are, I would bet on Zunesha being Uranus and Pluton still being a battleship that's hidden. But that egg is definitely still a wild card. As always, thank you guys for watching. Make sure to get yourself some One Piece manga with the link in the description. And in my hand, I have the bounty poster of either Kaido, Big Mom, or Boa Hancock. If you guys are wrong, you have to like, subscribe, and watch the next video. And the answer is the Snake Princess.